The birthday cake sat untouched on the silver platter at exactly 8:17 p.m., its chocolate frosting glistening under candlelight like polished obsidian. Beneath that innocent sweetness lay 7 years of calculated vengeance, each annual celebration another dose of death served with a smile. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned tradition into a weapon, and why her recipe for slow justice would take longer to kill a man than it took to build the railroad that made him rich. The year was 1852, and the Holloway Ranch stood like a fortress of Western prosperity in the high desert of New Mexico Territory. Tonight marked the master's 49th birthday, a milestone he would never reach as 50. In the kitchen below, Diana watched through the service window as the most powerful man in 3 counties raised his fork for the final time. Some poisons work fast. Others require patience. Diana had learned to measure revenge not in minutes, but in birthdays. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Holloway Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of New Mexico territory like a scar across the landscape, its boundaries marked by wooden posts that cast shadows long enough to measure a man's ambition. The main house rose 3 stories high, an architectural oddity in this land of adobe and timber, built from lumber hauled across 1,000 miles of desert, to prove that wealth could bend nature itself to its will. Red sandstone cliffs framed the property to the east, while to the west, the Rio Puerco cut through valleys where cattle grazed on grasslands that had belonged to someone else before maps were drawn and deeds were signed. Today marks September 14, 1852, and the ranch house blazed with lamplight against the gathering dusk. The scent of mesquite smoke from the kitchen fires mixed with the dry sage that grew wild along the property's edges, while dust from the day's cattle work still hung in the air like fine powder waiting to settle. Inside the main dining hall, crystal decanters caught the glow from dozens of candles, and threw amber light across walls hung with paintings of English countryside that bore no resemblance to the territory outside. Tonight celebrated the birthday of Thomas Holloway, the man who'd built this empire from a single land grant and the labor of people he'd purchased like livestock. 48 guests had arrived on horseback and in carriages from settlements across the territory, their wealth measured in acres and heads of cattle, and the number of enslaved workers who made such prosperity possible. They gathered to honor a man whose reputation stretched from Santa Fe to El Paso, whose word could make or break fortunes, whose cruelty was legendary, even in a time and place where brutality was commonplace. Diana moved through the sweltering kitchen like a shadow given form, her weathered hands arranging dishes she'd prepared since before dawn. At 41, she possessed a reputation as the finest cook in the territory, a skill that had kept her alive when others had been worked to death in the fields or sold away when they became inconvenient. Her dark eyes held secrets that would have terrified the birthday guests in the dining hall had they bothered to notice anything beyond her ability to serve them exactly what they desired. The kitchen occupied the entire ground floor of the western wing, a cavernous space with 3 hearths burning constantly and copper pots hanging from ceiling hooks like instruments in a surgeon's workshop. Steam rose from Dutch ovens where venison roasted alongside wild turkey, the air thick with the aroma of cornbread, roasted chilies, and Diana's famous chocolate cake. A recipe she'd learned from her mother, who'd learned it from hers. Techniques that predated their enslavement and connected them to a homeland none of them would ever see again. But today's menu included an ingredient that appeared in no cookbook and grew in no garden. Diana had spent 7 years perfecting this particular recipe, adding small measured doses to each annual birthday celebration, watching Thomas Holloway age faster than the calendar suggested, his robust health declining in ways that doctors attributed to the harsh climate and the stresses of managing such a vast enterprise. The poison came from arsenic, purchased in small quantities from the general store in Las Cruces, under the pretense of controlling rats in the grain storage. She'd learned about its properties from an old prospector named Silas Kane, a white man dying of consumption who'd shared his knowledge of minerals and metals during the months Diana had cared for him in his final days. Kane had worked in mines across 3 territories and understood the slow death that certain substances could deliver when administered in doses too small to raise immediate suspicion. Diana's story began 14 years earlier when she'd arrived at Holloway Ranch in chains purchased at auction in Santa Fe alongside 23 others. She'd been 27 then, torn from her previous owner's household in Missouri after he died, and his estate was liquidated to pay gambling debts. The journey west had taken 3 months, a nightmare of deprivation and casual violence that killed 6 of her fellow captives before they ever reached their destination. Thomas Holloway had bought her specifically for her cooking skills, having heard reports about her abilities from traders who moved between territories. He'd paid premium price, treating the transaction with the same calculating assessment he applied to purchasing breeding stock, or prime grazing land. Diana had watched him examine her teeth, test the strength of her hands, and discuss her potential value with the auctioneer, as if she were furniture being considered for a well-appointed home. The first 7 years at Holloway Ranch had been survival without hope of anything better. She'd cooked 3 meals daily for the main house, prepared food for ranch hands during cattle drives, and catered the elaborate social gatherings that Thomas Holloway hosted to demonstrate his status among territorial elite. She'd watched him conduct business over meals she'd prepared, listening to conversations about land acquisitions, political appointments, and the systematic displacement of indigenous peoples whose territories were being absorbed into the expanding American empire. She'd also witnessed his capacity for cruelty, the casual violence he inflicted on anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards. She'd seen him beat workers unconscious for minor infractions, sell families apart without consideration for human bonds, and exercise what he considered his right to absolute authority over every person he owned. The scars on her own back testified to his temper, punishment for a meal he deemed insufficiently seasoned, a transgression that had earned her 20 lashes delivered in the courtyard while other workers watched and learned what happened when you disappointed the master. But the catalyst for Diana's campaign of slow murder came in the autumn of 1845, when Thomas Holloway sold her daughter Rebecca to a brothel owner in Santa Fe. The girl had been 17, born during Diana's time in Missouri and brought west during that terrible journey. Holloway had decided that Rebecca's presence on the ranch represented wasted economic potential, that her youth and appearance could generate more profit in a different context, and he'd arranged the sale with the same efficiency he applied to all his business dealings. Diana had begged him to reconsider, had offered to work without any compensation beyond basic survival, had promised perfect obedience in perpetuity if he would only spare her daughter from that fate. Holloway had laughed, a sound that still echoed in Diana's memory 7 years later, and told her that she should be grateful he'd gotten such a good price. The transaction would help fund the new barn he was planning, he'd explained, and surely Diana understood that progress required certain sacrifices. Rebecca had died 6 months later from violence inflicted by one of her customers, a detail that reached Diana through the network of communication that existed between enslaved people across vast distances. The news had arrived on a spring morning when Diana was preparing breakfast, delivered by a traveling blacksmith who'd heard the story in Santa Fe and recognized the name. Diana had continued cooking without visible reaction, her hands steady as she flipped pancakes and fried eggs, but something fundamental had broken inside her that morning, some final thread of acceptance that had kept her compliant. The arsenic came into her possession 3 months after Rebecca's death, during the period when Silas Kane had been staying at the ranch, while Holloway negotiated mineral rights to land the prospector had claimed in the mountains to the north. Kane had grown fond of Diana during his visits to the kitchen, appreciating her cooking, and perhaps recognizing in her the same weariness with life that consumed him. During their conversations, he'd spoken freely about his years in mining camps, about the substances that could kill a man quickly or slowly depending on application, about the symptoms of arsenic poisoning that mimicked common ailments and rarely raised suspicion. When Kane died that August, Diana had searched his room and found a small leather pouch containing white powder, labeled with chemical notations she couldn't read but understood perfectly from their conversations. She'd hidden it in the flour bin, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for the right moment to begin what she now understood would be a long-term project requiring patience and precision. Thomas Holloway's birthday had always been an elaborate affair, a celebration that combined personal vanity with political networking. He invited territorial officials, wealthy ranchers, military officers from Fort Craig, and merchants whose businesses depended on his patronage. The gatherings lasted well into the night, fueled by whiskey imported from Kentucky and wine brought up from Mexico, featuring food that showcased Diana's skills and demonstrated Holloway's ability to provide luxuries in a harsh environment. The first poisoned birthday cake had been served on September 14, 1846, exactly 1 year after Rebecca's sale. Diana had measured the arsenic carefully, mixing just enough into the chocolate batter to begin the process without triggering immediate symptoms. She'd watched Holloway consume 3 pieces that night, praising her skills between bites, never suspecting that his favorite dessert had become the delivery mechanism for his eventual destruction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The genius of Diana's approach lay in its subtlety and patience. Arsenic poisoning, when administered in small, repeated doses over extended periods, produced symptoms that doctors of the era attributed to dozens of other causes. Fatigue, digestive problems, skin discoloration, hair loss, neurological issues, all could be explained away as consequences of age, stress, climate, or any number of common ailments that afflicted men living in harsh territories. Over 7 years, Diana had watched Thomas Holloway decline gradually, his robust health eroding like sandstone under persistent wind. He'd consulted doctors in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, specialists who'd examined him thoroughly and prescribed various treatments for conditions they couldn't quite diagnose. Some suspected consumption. Others thought perhaps he suffered from disorders of the liver or kidneys. None considered that he was being systematically poisoned by the cook who prepared every meal he consumed. Diana had been meticulous in her campaign, varying the dosages slightly each year, sometimes mixing small amounts into other dishes to maintain the accumulation in his system between birthdays. She'd studied his symptoms carefully, adjusting her approach based on his body's response, learning to read the signs of arsenic accumulation the way a doctor might track the progression of disease. Now, on this 49th birthday, she'd prepared what would be his final celebration. The dose in tonight's cake was larger than any previous year, calculated to push his already compromised system past the point of recovery. She'd spent weeks planning this moment, knowing that the accumulated poison in his body would make this final addition catastrophic. The birthday cake sat on the preparation table, 3 layers of dark chocolate perfection that represented the culmination of 7 years of patient vengeance. Its frosting gleamed like polished obsidian under lamplight, decorated with candied pecans and dusted with cocoa powder imported at considerable expense. To anyone examining it, the cake appeared to be another masterpiece from Diana's kitchen, indistinguishable from the dozens of elaborate desserts she'd created over the years. But Diana knew what lay beneath that innocent appearance. She knew that each bite contained enough arsenic to ensure that Thomas Holloway would never see 50, that his liver and kidneys were already so compromised by years of steady poisoning that this final dose would trigger complete organ failure within days. She'd researched the timeline carefully through observation and the medical knowledge she'd gleaned from conversations with various doctors who'd treated Holloway over the years. As the dinner hour approached and guests began arriving in the courtyard, Diana arranged the final dishes with artistic precision. Each plate represented years of enforced servitude. Each garnish carried memories of humiliations endured. Each carefully measured portion reflected the patience required to wage war against someone who held absolute power over your existence. What happens when the powerless discover that time itself can become a weapon, and that birthday celebrations can mark not years of life, but stages of dying? Diana was about to serve the final course in a meal that had been 7 years in preparation, a dessert that would taste like chocolate but deliver justice that no court in the territory would ever pronounce. Diana's reputation as a cook had been earned through decades of forced labor that transformed survival skills into artistry. She'd learned the fundamentals from her mother in Missouri, a woman named Clara who'd served in the household of a French merchant who appreciated fine cuisine. Those early lessons had covered more than recipes and techniques. They'd included instruction on how to please demanding palates, how to make limited ingredients stretch to feed more people than seemed possible, and how to maintain dignity while performing labor that benefited everyone except those whose hands created it. Her mother had been sold away when Diana was 19, purchased by a cotton planter in Mississippi who needed workers for his expanding operation. Diana never saw her again, never learned whether Clara survived the brutal transition from household service to field labor, never had the opportunity to say goodbye. The sale had been conducted on a Tuesday morning in March, completed before Diana returned from the market, where she'd been purchasing supplies for that evening's dinner party. The memory of returning to find her mother simply gone, erased from her life with the same casual efficiency used to dispose of broken furniture, had taught Diana an essential truth about her existence. Nothing was permanent except the system that owned her. No relationship could survive the economics of slavery. No bond between people mattered more than the profit calculations of those who controlled them. When Diana arrived at Holloway Ranch in 1838, she'd already been sold 4 times, each transaction eroding a little more of whatever hope she'd once harbored about the possibility of a tolerable existence. The journey west had been particularly brutal, a 3-month ordeal that reduced human beings to cargo transported with less care than valuable merchandise. 6 people had died during that crossing, their bodies buried in shallow graves along the trail, their names forgotten before the earth was tamped down over them. Thomas Holloway had been 35 when he purchased Diana, already well established as one of the territory's most successful ranchers. He'd built his empire through a combination of shrewd land acquisition, political connections, and the ruthless exploitation of labor that characterized the era. His ranch supplied beef to military forts, provided horses for mail routes, and served as a hub for trade networks that stretched from Texas to California. He ruled his domain with absolute authority, a petty king whose word was law across 12,000 acres, and whose temper was legendary throughout the territory. Workers who displeased him faced punishments that ranged from whipping to sale to conditions that amounted to execution by exposure to elements or impossible labor demands. He maintained order through fear, demonstrating regularly that resistance resulted in consequences severe enough to discourage anyone from attempting it. Diana's first year at the ranch had taught her the parameters of her new existence. She woke at 4 each morning to begin preparing breakfast for the main house, worked through the day preparing additional meals and managing the kitchen staff, and often continued past midnight when Holloway entertained guests who expected food and service until they decided to retire. She slept in a small room off the kitchen, a space barely large enough for the narrow cot that served as her bed, sharing walls thin enough that she could hear everything that happened in adjacent areas. The work itself was exhausting but familiar. She cooked for Holloway's household, for visiting dignitaries, for the seasonal workers who arrived during cattle drives, and for the elaborate social gatherings that demonstrated Holloway's status among territorial elite. She prepared traditional American dishes, adapted recipes to incorporate local ingredients, and created meals that earned praise from people who never considered that the person creating their food might resent every moment spent in their service. But the physical labor, demanding as it was, proved easier to endure than the psychological warfare that characterized life under Thomas Holloway's authority. He was a man who enjoyed demonstrating his power, who found satisfaction in reminding those he owned that their existence depended entirely on his continued willingness to let them live. He would praise Diana's cooking one moment and threaten to sell her to mine operators the next, keeping her perpetually off balance, never allowing her to feel secure enough to relax her guard. His cruelty manifested in dozens of ways, from the trivial to the catastrophic. He would demand meals at irregular hours, require elaborate preparations with insufficient notice, change his preferences without explanation, and punish any failure to anticipate his desires. He conducted inspections of the kitchen with the intensity of a military officer reviewing troops, pointing out perceived deficiencies and assigning punishments for infractions that existed only in his imagination. Diana had learned to navigate his moods, to read the subtle signs that indicated whether he would be reasonable or violent on any given day. She developed strategies for minimizing her exposure to his worst impulses, techniques for deflecting his attention toward other targets when necessary. She'd become expert at the kind of calculated servility that satisfied his ego, while preserving what little autonomy she could maintain. But nothing she'd learned could have prepared her for the morning in October 1845, when Thomas Holloway informed her that he'd sold Rebecca. The announcement came during breakfast preparation, delivered with the same casual tone he might use to discuss weather conditions or cattle prices. Diana had been rolling dough for biscuits when Holloway entered the kitchen, unusual because he typically waited in the dining room for meals to be brought to him. He'd watched her work for a moment before speaking, seeming to enjoy the anticipation of delivering news he knew would devastate her. "Rebecca fetched a good price in Santa Fe," he'd said. "Fellow named Garrett runs a high-class establishment there, caters to military officers and government officials. Said he'd pay premium for the right kind of girl. Your daughter fit his requirements exactly. Diana's hands had frozen in the dough, flour coating her fingers like powdered bone. She'd known Rebecca's presence on the ranch represented vulnerability, that a daughter made her susceptible to forms of coercion that single women could sometimes avoid. She'd tried to make Rebecca invisible, to keep her working in areas where Holloway rarely visited, to minimize any attention that might lead to exactly this outcome. But Holloway had noticed Rebecca despite Diana's efforts, had assessed her value in the same calculating way he evaluated all his assets, and had concluded that selling her would generate more profit than keeping her on the ranch. The decision was purely economic, devoid of any consideration for human relationships or the consequences of separating a mother from her daughter. Diana had begged. She'd abandoned dignity and pleaded for reconsideration, offering herself a surety for any lost value, promising perfect compliance with any demands if he would only reverse the transaction. She'd knelt on the kitchen floor, flour from her hands leaving white marks on the hem of his coat, and asked him to show mercy just this once. Holloway had looked down at her with something between amusement and contempt. "Mercy doesn't pay for new barns," he'd said. "Your girl is already on her way to Santa Fe. Garrett's men picked her up before dawn. Didn't want a scene. You should be grateful I got such a good price. Most buyers wouldn't pay premium for someone born on American soil." The sale had been conducted with efficiency that spoke to careful planning. Holloway had arranged everything in advance, timed the transaction to occur while Diana was occupied with mourning preparations, ensured that Rebecca was removed from the property before her mother could interfere or even say goodbye. By the time Diana learned what had happened, her daughter was already miles away, property transferred legally and irreversibly. Diana had continued preparing breakfast that morning because the alternative was punishment that wouldn't change anything. She'd served Holloway his meal with hands that trembled despite her efforts to control them, watched him eat food she'd prepared while discussing ranch business with his foreman, as if nothing significant had occurred. She'd cleaned the kitchen afterward, supervised the preparation of lunch, and moved through the rest of the day with mechanical precision that allowed no space for the grief threatening to consume her. The news of Rebecca's death reached Diana 6 months later through channels that existed beneath the surface of official society. A traveling blacksmith who'd worked in Santa Fe carried the story south, recognizing Rebecca's name from descriptions Diana had shared during his previous visits to the ranch. The details were sparse but sufficient. Rebecca had died from injuries inflicted by a customer at Garrett's establishment, her body buried in the potter's field on the outskirts of town, her death noted in no official records. Diana received this information while preparing dinner for one of Holloway's regular gatherings, a meal that would serve 30 guests and require her complete attention for hours. She'd thanked the blacksmith quietly, asked him to say nothing to anyone else, and returned to her work without visible reaction. She'd chopped vegetables, seasoned meat, prepared sauces, and served the meal with the same competence she always demonstrated. But something fundamental had changed. The grief that threatened to destroy her had transformed into something harder and colder, a determination that required neither hope nor belief in justice to sustain it. She'd spent 17 years in slavery learning to survive without power, but Rebecca's death had taught her that survival wasn't enough. Some things demanded response even when response seemed impossible. The question became not whether to act, but how to act in ways that wouldn't result in immediate discovery and execution. Diana understood that direct violence would accomplish nothing except her own death, and possibly the punishment of other workers blamed for failing to prevent her actions. She needed an approach that could succeed despite her complete lack of conventional power, a method that turned her position of forced servitude into an unexpected advantage. The answer came 3 months after Rebecca's death, during the period when Silas Kane stayed at the ranch. The old prospector had been dying slowly from consumption, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, and speaking with the fatalistic honesty of someone who knew his time was limited. He'd taken meals in the kitchen when his strength permitted, preferring Diana's company to the ranch hands who treated him with the cautious respect people reserve for those approaching death. Kane had talked freely during those visits, sharing stories from decades of prospecting across Western territories. He'd described mines in California and Nevada, camps in Colorado and Arizona, boomtowns that appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. He'd explained the properties of various minerals and metals, the techniques miners used to extract them, and the dangers inherent in working with substances that could heal or kill depending on application and dose. Arsenic had come up during a discussion of mining accidents. Kane had described workers who died from exposure to arsenic-contaminated dust in certain types of ore processing, explaining the symptoms and timeline of poisoning. He'd mentioned that small doses over extended periods produced effects that doctors often misdiagnosed as other ailments, that accumulated arsenic caused damage that became irreversible long before anyone suspected poisoning. Diana had listened carefully, asking questions that Kane answered without apparent suspicion. He'd seemed to appreciate having an intelligent audience for his stories, someone who engaged seriously with his experiences, rather than treating him as a curiosity or nuisance. He'd never suggested that Diana might apply this knowledge for purposes beyond academic interest, and she'd given him no reason to suspect otherwise. When Kane died in August 1845, Diana had searched his room while preparing it for the next guest. She'd found the leather pouch of white powder in his saddlebag, along with notebooks containing chemical formulas and observations about mineral properties. She'd taken the pouch, hidden it carefully, and spent the following weeks considering whether she possessed the courage to use it. The decision crystallized on September 14, 1845, Thomas Holloway's 42nd birthday. Diana had been preparing his celebration dinner, creating the elaborate meal he expected, when she'd overheard him discussing Rebecca's sale with guests who'd arrived early. He'd been boasting about the price he'd received, laughing about how he'd managed to conduct the transaction before Diana could interfere, treating his success at separating a mother from her daughter as evidence of shrewd business acumen. Diana had stood in the kitchen listening to that laughter, her hands steady as she measured ingredients for his birthday cake. She'd added the first dose of arsenic that afternoon, mixing it into batter that would become the foundation of a campaign lasting 7 years. She'd served the cake that evening with appropriate ceremony, watched Holloway consume 3 pieces while accepting congratulations from guests, and begun a process that would end with his death timed precisely to occur before his 50th birthday. The chemistry of murder required education that Diana acquired through observation, experimentation, and careful attention to details most people overlooked. Silas Kane's notebooks had provided theoretical foundation, but transforming theory into practice demanded skills Diana developed over months of solitary study in the hours between midnight and dawn when the kitchen belonged to her alone. Arsenic existed in several forms, but the white powder Kane had left behind was arsenic trioxide, the most common preparation used for everything from rat poison to pigment production and wallpaper manufacturing. Its availability made it perfect for Diana's purposes. She could acquire small quantities from general stores throughout the territory without raising suspicion, since ranch households routinely purchased arsenic for pest control in grain storage areas and livestock facilities. The substance itself was tasteless and nearly odorless when properly prepared, characteristics that made it ideal for covert administration. Mixed into strongly flavored foods, particularly the rich chocolate cake that Thomas Holloway favored, even large doses became virtually undetectable. The slight metallic aftertaste that sometimes accompanied arsenic consumption could be masked by chocolate's natural bitterness and the sweetness of sugar. But determining safe dosage, safe from the perspective of avoiding immediate detection rather than protecting the victim, required careful calculation. Diana needed to administer enough arsenic to ensure eventual lethality, while avoiding amounts that would trigger acute symptoms, obvious enough to prompt immediate investigation. The goal was chronic poisoning that mimicked natural illness, death that appeared to result from the gradual failure of organs weakened by age and environmental stress. Kane's notebooks contained references to cases of arsenic poisoning he'd witnessed in mining camps. Diana studied these accounts obsessively, noting patterns in symptom development and timelines for various outcomes. She learned that acute poisoning from large single doses produced violent symptoms, including severe vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea that could lead to death within hours. Such obvious poisoning would immediately raise suspicions and trigger investigations. Chronic poisoning from repeated small doses produced different effects. Victims developed symptoms gradually over weeks or months, experiencing fatigue, digestive problems, skin changes, hair loss, and neurological issues that doctors typically attributed to other causes. Death from chronic arsenic poisoning could take years, allowing the poisoner to maintain their campaign while the victim declined in ways that appeared natural. Diana's strategy required patience unprecedented in most murder cases. She would administer arsenic primarily through Holloway's annual birthday cake, supplemented by occasional smaller doses mixed into other dishes throughout the year. This approach would allow sufficient time between major doses for symptoms to develop and be misdiagnosed, creating a medical history that would make eventual death appear to be the culmination of chronic illness rather than deliberate poisoning. The first experimental subject was not Thomas Holloway, but rats in the grain storage facility. Diana trapped specimens during her night kitchen work, keeping them in cages hidden in unused areas of the building. She fed them varying doses of arsenic mixed into food scraps, documenting the results in crude notes hidden beneath loose floorboards in her sleeping quarters. These experiments taught her essential information about dose-response relationships. Very small doses caused minimal observable effects. Moderate doses produced lethargy and reduced appetite, but didn't always prove fatal. Large doses killed quickly, but with obvious symptoms. Diana needed to find the optimal range that would cause cumulative damage without triggering immediate crisis. She learned that arsenic accumulated in the body over time, particularly in hair, nails, and bone tissue. Repeated exposure allowed the poison to build to lethal levels, even when individual doses might be too small to cause acute symptoms. This bioaccumulation effect was critical to her strategy. By administering regular small doses over years, she could ensure that Holloway's body gradually became saturated with arsenic until his organs could no longer function. The medical knowledge required to implement this strategy came from multiple sources. Diana had decades of experience caring for sick workers on the ranch, knowledge gained from necessity since enslaved people received minimal medical attention from professional physicians. She'd learned to recognize symptoms of various illnesses, understand basic anatomy and physiology, and make educated guesses about treatment approaches that might help or harm patients. She also gained information from conversations with the various doctors who visited the ranch to treat Thomas Holloway and his family. These physicians often discussed cases while Diana served them meals or waited in adjacent rooms. She listened carefully to their diagnostic reasoning, noting which symptoms they associated with which conditions, learning the medical terminology they used to describe organ function and disease processes. Dr. Nathan Porter proved particularly instructive. He served as Holloway's primary physician and visited the ranch quarterly to conduct routine examinations. Porter was a competent practitioner trained in Philadelphia, knowledgeable about current medical theory, but limited by the diagnostic tools available in 1840s frontier practice. He relied heavily on patient history, physical examination, and basic laboratory tests that couldn't detect most poisons. Diana learned from Porter's conversations with Holloway that doctors of the era had limited ability to diagnose arsenic poisoning unless they specifically suspected it and conducted appropriate tests. The symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure overlapped significantly with dozens of other conditions including liver disease, kidney failure, digestive disorders, and neurological conditions. Without reason to suspect poisoning, most physicians would exhaust conventional diagnostic possibilities before considering toxic exposure. This knowledge gave Diana confidence that her campaign could succeed if she maintained discipline and avoided patterns that might trigger suspicion. The key was ensuring that Holloway's symptoms developed gradually, remained consistent with common illnesses, and never became severe enough immediately after consuming her food to suggest a causal relationship. The first poisoned birthday cake was prepared with meticulous care on September 14, 1846. Diana had calculated the dose based on her rat experiments, adjusting for Holloway's greater body mass and targeting an amount that would begin the accumulation process without triggering acute symptoms. She'd mix the arsenic thoroughly into the chocolate batter, ensuring even distribution throughout the cake, and baked at a temperature she'd verified wouldn't degrade the poison's effectiveness. Serving the cake required psychological discipline Diana had developed through years of forced servitude. She presented it with appropriate ceremony, accepted Holloway's compliments about the quality of her baking, and watched without visible emotion as he consumed 3 large pieces over the course of the evening celebration. She'd memorized details of his appearance that night, creating a baseline against which she could measure future changes. The days following that first dose tested Diana's patience and nerve. She watched Holloway carefully for any signs of acute poisoning that would indicate she'd miscalculated the dose. She monitored his meals, his energy levels, his interactions with others, looking for evidence that the arsenic was affecting him. For the first week, she observed no obvious changes and began to worry that she'd administered too small an amount. But by the second week, subtle shifts became apparent. Holloway complained of fatigue and digestive discomfort. He mentioned to Dr. Porter during a routine visit that he'd been experiencing occasional nausea and a general sense of malaise. Porter examined him, found nothing alarming in his vital signs or physical condition, and attributed the symptoms to overwork and the stress of managing a large ranch operation. This diagnosis confirmed Diana's understanding of how the poison would operate. The symptoms were real but nonspecific, easily explained by common conditions, insufficient to trigger concern about anything more serious than temporary indisposition. Porter prescribed rest and a bland diet for a few days, recommendations that Holloway ignored because he refused to show weakness or adjust his schedule for minor discomfort. Over the following months, Diana administered occasional supplementary doses through other dishes. She'd mix minute amounts of arsenic into gravies, sauces, and preparations where the flavor would be completely masked. These smaller doses maintained the accumulation process between birthday celebrations, ensuring that the poison's presence in Holloway's system remained constant. She varied her approach to avoid patterns that might be detected through careful analysis. Sometimes she'd go weeks without adding any arsenic, allowing Holloway's symptoms to stabilize or even improve slightly. This variation made it even more difficult for anyone to establish a relationship between his illness and food consumption. The fluctuating nature of his condition suggested chronic disease with periods of exacerbation and remission rather than steady progression from a single cause. Diana documented everything in her mind, lacking the ability to keep written records that might be discovered and used as evidence. She memorized dates, doses, symptoms, and Holloway's reactions. She tracked his weight loss over months, noted changes in his skin color and texture, observed how his stamina declined gradually over years. This mental record allowed her to adjust her approach based on empirical evidence rather than guesswork. The second birthday cake in 1847 contained a slightly larger dose than the first, calculated to build on the foundation already established in Holloway's system. Diana had learned from the previous year that her initial conservative estimate had been too cautious. She needed to be more aggressive, while remaining within the parameters that would avoid acute crisis. Holloway consumed 4 pieces of that second cake, praising Diana's baking skills, even as he complained about persistent digestive problems he'd been experiencing for months. Dr. Porter attended the birthday celebration and observed Holloway's condition with growing concern. The physician noted that his patient had lost weight, developed a grayish tint to his complexion, and was experiencing symptoms that didn't quite fit any standard diagnostic category. Porter ordered additional tests and consultations with specialists in Santa Fe, examinations that found evidence of liver dysfunction and possible kidney problems, but no definitive diagnosis. The doctors discussed various possibilities including chronic dyspepsia, liver cirrhosis from alcohol consumption, and environmental factors related to living in harsh frontier conditions. None suggested poisoning because Holloway showed no symptoms of acute toxic exposure and had no apparent enemies with the means and opportunity to poison him over extended periods. This medical attention actually helped Diana's cause by establishing a documented history of chronic illness with no identified cause. Each doctor's report became another piece of evidence that Holloway was dying from natural disease progression rather than deliberate intervention. The more specialists examined him and found nothing definitive, the more his eventual death would appear to be mysterious medical failure rather than murder. By the third year, 1848, Diana had refined her technique to an art form. She'd learned exactly how much arsenic Holloway's compromised system could tolerate without triggering obvious crisis. She'd developed instincts about when to administer supplementary doses and when to allow his body time to process accumulated poison. She'd become expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated his organs were failing gradually, systematically, in ways that would eventually prove irreversible. The campaign required constant vigilance and adjustment. Diana had to account for variables including Holloway's diet apart from what she prepared, his alcohol consumption, which was substantial, his activity levels, which affected his metabolism, and seasonal changes that influenced his overall health. She treated the poisoning like a complex recipe that required perfect balance between multiple ingredients, timing each addition to achieve the desired final result. The seventh birthday celebration began at 6 in the evening on September 14, 1852, with guests arriving in waves as the desert sun painted the horizon in shades of copper and rust. Thomas Holloway stood at the entrance to his ranch house, greeting each arrival with handshakes and forced enthusiasm that barely concealed how much the effort cost him. At 48, he looked closer to 60, his face gaunt and gray, his once powerful frame reduced by years of unexplained illness that had baffled every physician who examined him. Diana watched from the kitchen window as Holloway moved among his guests, noting how he paused frequently to catch his breath, how his hand trembled slightly when raising his whiskey glass, how his smile never quite reached his eyes anymore. 7 years of careful poisoning had transformed him from a robust tyrant into a weakened shadow, his body failing in ways that accumulated medical records attributed to chronic liver disease, possible kidney dysfunction, and neurological deterioration of unknown origin. The dining hall filled with territorial elite who traveled from across New Mexico to attend what had become an annual tradition. Ranchers from the Pecos Valley, merchants from Las Cruces, military officers from Fort Craig, and territorial officials from Santa Fe gathered around tables laden with food that represented Diana's finest work. Roasted venison glazed with honey and chilies, wild turkey stuffed with cornbread and sage, vegetables harvested from the ranch gardens, and fresh bread still warm from the ovens. But the centerpiece remained the birthday cake, 3 layers of dark chocolate that sat on a silver platter like an offering to gods who demanded sacrifice. Diana had prepared this particular cake with doses calculated based on 7 years of observation and adjustment. She'd increased the arsenic content significantly from previous years, knowing that Holloway's compromised organs could no longer process even moderate amounts of poison without catastrophic failure. This final cake contained enough arsenic to ensure that the accumulation in his system would cross the threshold from chronic poisoning to acute crisis within days. His liver, already damaged by years of toxic exposure, would fail completely when confronted with this additional burden. His kidneys, struggling to filter waste from blood contaminated by accumulated poison, would shut down. His heart, weakened by neurological damage from long-term arsenic exposure, would stop. Diana had timed everything precisely. The symptoms would begin within 24 hours, initially manifesting as severe digestive distress that doctors would attribute to food poisoning or gastric crisis. Within 48 hours, Holloway would develop jaundice as his liver failed, confusion as toxins accumulated in his blood, and cardiovascular instability as his heart struggled to maintain function. Within 72 hours, he would be dead. The evening progressed according to the familiar rhythm of Holloway's birthday celebrations. Guests consumed elaborate meals while discussing politics, business, and territorial affairs. They praised Diana's cooking between conversations about land deals and cattle prices, never considering that the woman serving their food might harbor any feelings beyond gratitude for the opportunity to demonstrate her skills. Holloway held court at the head of the main table, accepting congratulations on reaching another year despite his obvious ill health. Several guests commented on his appearance, expressing concern about his continued weight loss and declining vitality. He dismissed their worries with bravado that sounded hollow even to those who wanted to believe it, claiming that frontier life was hard on everyone and that he'd outlived them all through sheer determination. Dr. Nathan Porter attended the celebration, as he had every year since becoming Holloway's physician. He sat near his patient, observing him with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years trying to diagnose conditions that defied explanation. Porter had reviewed Holloway's case with specialists across the territory, consulted medical texts from back east, and exhausted every diagnostic possibility he could imagine. Nothing explained the constellation of symptoms his patient displayed. Diana served the meal's multiple courses with mechanical efficiency, moving between kitchen and dining hall while maintaining the subservient posture expected of her. She accepted compliments about the food without expression, refilled glasses without being asked, and remained invisible in the way that enslaved people learned to become when surrounded by those who owned them. But inside, she counted down to the moment when the birthday cake would be served. That moment arrived at 8:30, after the main courses had been cleared and guests had enjoyed sufficient time to digest before dessert. Diana carried the cake into the dining hall on a silver platter, candles blazing across its surface, creating shadows that danced across walls hung with paintings of landscapes that bore no resemblance to the territory outside. The assembled guests sang the traditional birthday song, while Holloway stood to receive his cake, his smile fixed in place despite the obvious effort required to maintain appearances. He made a show of blowing out the candles, of making a wish he would never live to see fulfilled, of accepting the applause from people who'd traveled considerable distances to celebrate a man whose cruelty had made him wealthy at their expense as well. Diana cut the cake into generous portions, ensuring that Holloway received the largest piece, a slice that contained proportionally more arsenic than any other. She served him personally, placing the plate before him with hands that remained perfectly steady, despite the significance of the moment. This was the culmination of 7 years of patient work, the final act in a drama that had begun the morning Thomas Holloway laughed about selling her daughter. Holloway consumed his cake with evident pleasure, praising Diana's baking skills between bites. The chocolate was rich and dark, the frosting perfectly sweetened, the texture exactly as he preferred. He ate every bite on his plate, then accepted a second serving when Diana offered it, consuming poison with the same greed he'd shown for everything else in his life. Other guests ate their portions as well, but Diana had been careful to ensure that only Holloway's slices contained lethal amounts of arsenic. The remaining cake was perfectly safe, a precaution that would make it impossible to link any subsequent illness specifically to the dessert. When the inevitable investigation occurred, tests of leftover cake would reveal nothing suspicious, supporting the conclusion that Holloway had died from natural progression of chronic disease rather than deliberate poisoning. The celebration continued past midnight, guests drinking Holloway's imported whiskey and smoking cigars while discussing territorial politics and business opportunities. Holloway participated as long as his strength permitted, but Diana noticed him flagging earlier than in previous years, his energy depleted by the effort of maintaining social obligations, while his body struggled to process the massive dose of poison he'd just consumed. By 1 in the morning, guests began departing, thanking Holloway for his hospitality and expressing hopes that he'd feel better soon. Several mentioned again their concern about his health, urging him to seek additional medical consultations in larger cities where more advanced treatments might be available. Holloway assured them he was fine, just tired from the excitement of the evening, and would resume normal activities after a good night's rest. Diana cleaned the kitchen while the last guests departed, scrubbing pots and storing leftovers with the same methodical attention she applied to every task. She wrapped the remaining cake carefully, knowing it would be examined later, ensuring that her handling left no evidence that might raise questions. She worked until 3 in the morning, preparing the kitchen for the next day's meals, maintaining routines that had defined her existence for 14 years. When she finally retreated to her small sleeping quarters off the kitchen, Diana lay awake on her narrow cot and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into silence. Somewhere in the main house, Thomas Holloway slept without knowing that he would never see his 50th birthday, that his body was already beginning the final crisis that would end his life within days, that justice delayed for 7 years was finally arriving. Diana felt no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction beyond the grim knowledge that she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. Rebecca was still dead, sold and destroyed by a system that reduced human beings to property. But Thomas Holloway would join her soon, his death a small payment against an unpayable debt, a gesture of defiance against a world that had given Diana no other means of resistance. What happens when patience becomes a weapon and birthdays mark not celebration but countdown to execution? Thomas Holloway was about to discover that some debts are paid in doses too small to notice until the final accounting comes due. Thomas Holloway woke at dawn on September 15th with cramping in his abdomen that felt like claws tearing through his insides. He barely made it to the chamber pot before violent vomiting seized him, his body expelling the previous night's celebration in waves that left him gasping and weak. The pain intensified with each spasm, radiating from his stomach through his chest and back, a burning sensation that felt like he'd swallowed fire. By mid-morning, his condition had deteriorated enough that his foreman sent riders to fetch Dr. Nathan Porter from his practice in Las Cruces. The physician arrived by early afternoon to find his patient in severe distress. Skin pale and clammy, pulse rapid and weak, pupils dilated despite the bright sunlight streaming through bedroom windows. Porter conducted a thorough examination, noting symptoms that suggested acute gastric crisis, possibly complicated by the chronic conditions he'd been monitoring for years. Diana prepared bland foods at Porter's instruction, broths and weak teas that Holloway could barely keep down. She moved through the sick room with appropriate concern, her expression carefully neutral as she observed the progression of symptoms she'd anticipated based on 7 years of study. The arsenic was doing exactly what she'd calculated it would do, triggering cascading organ failure in a body already compromised by years of accumulated poison. Porter remained at the ranch for 3 days, monitoring his patient's decline with growing alarm. Holloway developed jaundice on the 2nd day, his skin taking on a yellow cast that indicated liver failure. His mental state deteriorated as toxins built up in his bloodstream, confusion alternating with periods of agitation, where he accused people of conspiracies that existed only in his poisoned mind. His heart rhythm became irregular, requiring constant monitoring to prevent complete cardiovascular collapse. On the 3rd day, September 17th, Porter consulted with 2 other physicians hastily summoned from Santa Fe. The 3 doctors reviewed Holloway's medical history, examined him thoroughly, and discussed possible diagnoses in hushed conversations outside his bedroom. They concluded that he was experiencing acute liver and kidney failure, likely representing the terminal phase of the chronic disease that had been consuming him for years. None suggested poisoning because the timeline didn't fit acute toxic exposure, and chronic poisoning seemed impossible given the controlled environment of the ranch. Thomas Holloway died at 4:20 in the afternoon on September 18, 1852, exactly 4 days after his 49th birthday celebration. His final hours were marked by delirium and physical distress that morphed into unconsciousness before his heart finally stopped. Dr. Porter recorded the cause of death as acute hepatic failure secondary to chronic liver disease of unknown etiology, a diagnosis that satisfied territorial authorities and required no further investigation. The funeral was held 2 days later, attended by the same guests who'd celebrated his birthday less than a week earlier. They gathered in the ranch's courtyard while a minister from Las Cruces delivered a eulogy that praised Holloway's contributions to territorial development and his success in building one of the region's most prosperous cattle operations. The irony of honoring a man whose wealth came from stolen labor and systematic cruelty was lost on no one who'd been enslaved by him, but they maintained appropriate expressions of sorrow while internally calculating what his death might mean for their own futures. Diana prepared the funeral meal with the same care she'd brought to every other task assigned to her. She cooked for mourners who consumed roasted meats and fresh bread, while discussing how Holloway's death would affect territorial politics and business relationships. She listened to their conversations about his estate, about who would inherit the ranch, about what changes might occur now that its founder was dead. The reading of Holloway's will occurred 1 week after his burial, conducted by a lawyer from Santa Fe in the ranch's main office. The document revealed that Holloway had left the property to his brother Edmund, a merchant living in St. Louis who'd visited the ranch only twice in 14 years. Edmund would have to decide whether to relocate to New Mexico and manage the operation himself, or sell it to one of several interested buyers who'd already begun making inquiries. For Diana and the other enslaved workers, this uncertainty represented both danger and possibility. A new owner might prove more humane than Holloway, though that set an extremely low bar for comparison. Alternatively, Edmund might decide to liquidate all assets, including human property, leading to sales that would scatter the ranch's workforce across the territory. Diana had survived transitions before, and knew that each one carried risks that could destroy whatever fragile stability had been achieved. But in the immediate aftermath of Holloway's death, ranch operations continued under the supervision of the foreman who'd managed day-to-day activities for years. Diana maintained her position in the kitchen, preparing meals for the reduced household and occasional visitors who came to pay respects or conduct business related to the estate. She worked with the same efficiency she'd always demonstrated, giving no indication that anything had changed beyond the absence of the man she'd spent 7 years killing. 3 weeks after the funeral, Dr. Porter returned to collect medical records and personal effects he'd left at the ranch during Holloway's final illness. He found Diana in the kitchen preparing dinner and paused to express his regret about her master's death, a courtesy that struck her as absurd given that she'd engineered that death with more precision than Porter had brought to any of his diagnoses. Porter mentioned that he'd been reviewing Holloway's case with colleagues, trying to understand what had caused such dramatic decline in a man who'd been relatively healthy 7 years earlier. The progression didn't quite fit standard patterns for liver disease or any other common condition. Several specialists had suggested that environmental factors unique to frontier living might have contributed, possibly exposure to toxic substances in water or soil, though no definitive evidence supported that theory. Diana listened without comment, maintaining the passive expression expected of her while internally marveling at how close Porter had come to the truth without quite grasping it. He'd recognized that something environmental had poisoned his patient, but hadn't considered that the environment in question was the food Holloway consumed at every meal, prepared by hands that had more reason to hate him than any doctor trained in Philadelphia could imagine. The investigation that Diana had anticipated never materialized because no one suspected murder. Holloway had been visibly ill for years, declining gradually under medical supervision, with symptoms documented by multiple physicians who'd found no evidence of foul play. His death, while relatively sudden in its final phase, fit the pattern of chronic disease reaching terminal stage. The fact that it occurred shortly after his birthday celebration seemed coincidental rather than significant, particularly since other guests who'd consumed the same food remained perfectly healthy. Diana's 7-year campaign succeeded precisely because she'd understood that patience and subtlety would accomplish what dramatic action could not. She'd recognized that arsenic administered in carefully calibrated doses over extended periods would mimic natural disease progression, that symptoms would be attributed to common ailments rather than deliberate poisoning, and that her position as enslaved cook made her simultaneously essential and invisible. But success brought no satisfaction beyond grim acknowledgement that she'd done what she'd set out to do. Rebecca remained dead, sold and destroyed by a system that continued operating exactly as before. Thomas Holloway's death changed nothing fundamental about the world that had enabled his cruelty. His brother would inherit the ranch, other enslaved people would continue suffering under whoever controlled them next, and the cycle of exploitation would persist, regardless of individual fates. What happens when justice served over 7 years brings no peace, only the hollow victory of surviving long enough to witness your oppressor's death? Diana was about to discover that ending one life doesn't dismantle the system that made that life possible, and that some victories taste like ashes even when they're exactly what you planned. The story of Thomas Holloway's death should have ended with his burial in the ranch cemetery, marked by a sandstone monument that listed his name and dates, without mentioning how those dates had been determined by someone he'd considered property. But stories have ways of escaping the boundaries their participants intend, particularly when those stories involve knowledge that others might find useful for their own purposes. Diana's method spread through networks that existed beneath the surface of territorial society, carried by conversations between enslaved workers who moved between ranches and settlements. The details emerged gradually during those exchanges, shared in the careful coded language that people developed when any direct communication about resistance could result in execution. A cook who'd achieved what Diana had accomplished became a source of inspiration and practical instruction for others trapped in similar circumstances. The first indication that Diana's technique was being replicated came 4 months after Holloway's death, when a wealthy rancher in the Pecos Valley died suddenly after years of mysterious declining health. The circumstances mirrored Holloway's case closely enough that Dr. Porter, who'd consulted on both, began to notice patterns that troubled him. Both men had been robust before experiencing gradual deterioration over multiple years. Both had displayed similar constellations of symptoms that defied definitive diagnosis. Both had died shortly after elaborate celebrations featuring food prepared by long-term kitchen staff. Porter shared his observations with colleagues at a medical conference in Santa Fe, suggesting that some environmental factor unique to large ranching operations might be affecting owners in ways that weren't yet understood. Other physicians mentioned similar cases they'd encountered, creating a disturbing picture of powerful men dying from conditions that looked like natural disease but followed suspiciously consistent patterns. But the medical establishment's investigation focused on environmental toxins, contaminated water sources, and occupational hazards related to cattle ranching. None seriously considered that enslaved kitchen workers might be systematically poisoning their owners using methods sophisticated enough to avoid detection by trained physicians. The idea seemed implausible because it required acknowledging that people dismissed as intellectually inferior possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the social order. By the summer of 1853, reports of mysterious deaths among ranch owners and wealthy households had increased throughout New Mexico Territory and neighboring regions. The victims shared certain characteristics, including ownership of large enslaved workforces, reputations for harsh treatment, and long-term kitchen staff who'd served them for years. The deaths occurred gradually rather than suddenly, preceded by months or years of declining health that physicians attributed to various chronic conditions. Territorial authorities began investigating these deaths more seriously after a prominent Santa Fe merchant died under circumstances that particularly alarmed officials. The merchant had been involved in the slave trade, acquiring and selling human beings throughout the Southwest, and his death came after a period of illness that family members insisted didn't match his previous health problems. An autopsy revealed evidence of organ damage consistent with chronic toxic exposure, though examiners couldn't identify the specific substance responsible. The investigation focused initially on possible contamination in imported goods, or locally produced foodstuffs, that might affect entire populations. Authorities tested water supplies, examined grain storage facilities, and analyzed samples from various sources without finding definitive evidence of widespread poisoning. The deaths seemed isolated to specific individuals rather than representing public health crises, which complicated efforts to identify common causes. But patterns emerged for those trained to recognize them. The victims were overwhelmingly men who'd accumulated wealth through enterprises involving enslaved labor. Their households employed long-term kitchen staff who'd been present for years before symptoms began. The progression of illness followed remarkably similar timelines across different cases, suggesting systematic rather than random causation. Most significantly, the deaths occurred after elaborate social gatherings or celebrations, where food played central roles. Diana learned about these investigations through the communication networks that connected enslaved people across vast distances. Travelers brought news from other territories, sharing stories about deaths that sounded suspiciously familiar, about authorities searching for explanations they couldn't quite grasp, about growing paranoia among the planter class regarding the food their servants prepared. She also heard rumors that she'd become something of a legend among enslaved workers, though the stories distorted details and attributed to her capabilities she'd never claimed. Some versions suggested she'd poisoned dozens of people at Holloway's birthday celebration, that she'd developed supernatural abilities to curse her enemies, that she'd escaped punishment through deals with forces beyond human understanding. Diana found these embellishments simultaneously amusing and troubling, recognizing that legends could inspire resistance, but also attract attention that might prove dangerous. The reality was more complex than any legend could capture. Diana had spent 7 years carefully poisoning one man using techniques that required patience and precision. She'd succeeded because she'd been methodical rather than dramatic, subtle rather than spectacular. The spread of similar techniques throughout the territory suggested that others had learned from her example, adapting the method to their own circumstances, creating a distributed campaign of resistance that authorities struggled to comprehend or combat. By autumn of 1853, the psychological impact of these deaths had begun affecting social structures throughout the territory. Wealthy households started hiring white cooks exclusively, though qualified candidates were scarce and expensive. Some families began preparing their own meals rather than trusting servants, a practice that undermined the social customs that defined their status. Others employed food tasters, hiring people whose job was to consume meals before their employers risked eating, a precaution that acknowledged their vulnerability while doing nothing to address its causes. The paranoia extended beyond individual households to affect broader social gatherings. Attendance at large celebrations declined as people weighed the risks of consuming food prepared by kitchen staff they couldn't monitor personally. The elaborate dinner parties and festivals that had been central to territorial society became smaller, more cautious affairs, where hosts felt compelled to explain the provenance of every dish and guests ate carefully rather than enthusiastically. Diana observed these changes with mixed feelings. The fear afflicting those who'd profited from slavery represented a form of justice, forcing them to experience a fraction of the constant vulnerability that defined enslaved existence. But she also recognized that fear might produce harsher treatment rather than reforms, that paranoid owners might respond with increased violence rather than questioning the system that made such resistance necessary. Edmund Holloway arrived from St. Louis in November 1853 to take possession of his inherited ranch. He'd spent months reviewing financial records and consulting with territorial businessmen before deciding to relocate and manage the property himself rather than selling it. His decision meant that Diana would continue in her position, serving another member of the family that had owned her for 15 years. Edmund proved different from his brother in temperament, though not in fundamental beliefs about human property. He was more educated, more interested in current events and intellectual pursuits, less inclined toward casual violence. But he shared Thomas's assumptions about racial hierarchy and the legitimacy of slavery, viewing the institution as economically necessary and morally acceptable, despite growing controversy in other parts of the nation. Diana prepared meals for Edmund with the same care she'd brought to serving his brother, though without the immediate motivation for poisoning that had driven her previous campaign. Edmund hadn't sold her daughter, hadn't personally inflicted the cruelties that had defined her relationship with Thomas, but he benefited from and perpetuated the same system, and his arrival represented continuity rather than change in the fundamental circumstances of her existence. What happens when individual acts of resistance inspire broader movements that authorities can neither fully comprehend nor effectively combat? The territory was discovering that some forms of rebellion spread like recipes, shared between people who'd learned that kitchen skills could serve purposes beyond preparing meals, and that patience applied over years could accomplish what immediate violence never could. The investigation that would eventually expose Diana's campaign began not with brilliant detective work, but with a random conversation between two physicians comparing notes about puzzling cases. Dr. Nathan Porter met Dr. Samuel Whitmore at a medical conference in Albuquerque during March 1854, 18 months after Thomas Holloway's death. Both men had been troubled by patterns they'd observed in wealthy patients who died from what appeared to be chronic degenerative conditions that didn't quite fit established medical categories. Whitmore had treated 3 such cases over the past 2 years, all involving ranch owners or prosperous merchants who'd declined over extended periods before dying from organ failure that autopsies suggested might involve toxic exposure. Porter had encountered similar cases, including Holloway's death and 2 others he'd consulted on since then. When they compared their observations in detail, the similarities became too striking to dismiss as coincidence. Both physicians noted that victims had been served by long-term kitchen staff, predominantly enslaved women who'd worked in their households for years before symptoms began. The progression of illness followed remarkably consistent timelines across different cases, typically spanning multiple years from initial symptoms to death. Most significantly, several victims had experienced acute crises shortly after birthday celebrations, or other elaborate meals featuring dishes prepared by these same kitchen workers. Porter and Whitmore presented their findings to a panel of territorial physicians and law enforcement officials, suggesting that systematic poisoning might explain these mysterious deaths. The presentation met with skepticism from some attendees who found it difficult to believe that enslaved workers possessed the knowledge and capability to conduct such sophisticated campaigns. But the evidence was compelling enough that territorial authorities authorized formal investigations into several suspicious deaths, including Thomas Holloway's. The investigation into Holloway's case began in April 1854 with the exhumation of his body from the ranch cemetery. Forensic examination revealed high concentrations of arsenic in hair, nail, and bone tissue, levels consistent with chronic exposure over multiple years. Similar examinations of other suspected poisoning victims confirmed the pattern, establishing that multiple wealthy men throughout the territory had died from long-term arsenic poisoning rather than natural causes. Attention focused immediately on kitchen staff who'd prepared meals for these victims. Investigators questioned dozens of enslaved workers, searching for evidence of conspiracy or coordination between households. Most denied any knowledge of poisoning, maintaining that they'd simply prepared food according to instructions and had no involvement in their employers' deaths. But investigators noted that several cooks had disappeared from their positions in the months following their employers' deaths, suggesting consciousness of guilt. Diana remained at Holloway Ranch under Edmund's ownership, having no reason to flee given that Thomas's death had occurred nearly 2 years earlier and had been attributed to natural causes at the time. She continued working in the kitchen with the same competence she'd always demonstrated, preparing meals for Edmund and occasional visitors, maintaining routines that had defined her existence for 16 years. The knock came on a morning in late May when she was preparing breakfast. Federal Marshal William Crawford arrived with 2 deputies and a warrant authorizing Diana's arrest on suspicion of murder. Crawford was a serious man who'd served as a marshal for 12 years, investigating crimes across New Mexico territory with methodical thoroughness that had earned him respect among both law enforcement colleagues and the communities he served. He found Diana in the kitchen rolling dough for biscuits, her hands dusted with flour, her expression calm when he explained the purpose of his visit. She'd been expecting this moment since learning about the exhumation, had prepared herself mentally for whatever consequences her actions might bring. She wiped flour from her hands, removed her apron, and accompanied Crawford to his waiting carriage without resistance or protest. The trial began in Santa Fe on July 10, 1854, in a courthouse packed with spectators who'd traveled from across the territory to witness proceedings that would determine whether an enslaved woman could be held legally accountable for murdering her owner. The case presented unusual legal challenges because Diana's status as property complicated questions about criminal responsibility and the rights of the accused. The prosecution was led by territorial attorney Harrison Mitchell, a capable lawyer who'd built his career on high-profile cases involving fraud, violence, and property disputes. Mitchell presented evidence of arsenic poisoning established through forensic examination of Holloway's remains, testimony from physicians who'd treated him during his final years, and documentation of Diana's access to arsenic through her kitchen duties. The defense was undertaken by Jacob Thornton, an attorney from Boston who'd relocated to New Mexico specifically to practice law in cases involving enslaved people. Thornton had abolitionist sympathies unusual for the territory, and saw Diana's case as an opportunity to challenge assumptions about criminal responsibility within the institution of slavery. His strategy focused on establishing that Diana's actions, while technically constituting murder, occurred within a context of systematic oppression that made conventional legal standards difficult to apply. Thornton argued that a person classified as property under territorial law could not be held to the same standards of criminal accountability as free citizens. He presented evidence of Thomas Holloway's cruelty, including testimony from other enslaved workers about beatings, family separations, and the specific sale of Diana's daughter that had motivated her campaign. He contended that Diana had acted in response to unbearable circumstances that left her no legal recourse for protecting herself or her family. The trial lasted 3 weeks and generated intense debate about slavery, justice, and the limits of legal accountability in a society built on human bondage. Newspapers across the nation covered the proceedings, with Northern abolitionist publications treating Diana as a hero fighting tyranny, while Southern papers condemned her as a murderer who deserved execution for challenging the social order. Diana testified in her own defense during the trial's final week, speaking publicly for the first time about the 7 years she'd spent poisoning Thomas Holloway. Her testimony was detailed and unflinching, describing her methodology, her motivation, and her complete lack of remorse for actions she considered justified under circumstances that gave her no alternative means of resistance. She explained how she'd learned about arsenic from Silas Kane, how she'd tested dosages on rats before administering them to Holloway, how she'd calculated each dose to avoid detection while ensuring eventual lethality. She described watching him decline over years, adjusting her technique based on his symptoms, maintaining patience through thousands of meals that brought him gradually closer to death. When Mitchell asked if she felt any guilt about murdering a man who'd never been convicted of any crime, Diana's response silenced the packed courtroom. "He was guilty of selling my daughter to a brothel where she was killed," she said. "He was guilty of treating human beings as property to be disposed of for profit. He was guilty of building his wealth through the suffering of people he claimed to own. What court would have heard those charges? What judge would have ruled against him? I delivered the only justice available to me." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of murder through prolonged poisoning. The evidence was overwhelming, and Diana had confessed in detail to her actions. But the verdict carried footnotes unusual in criminal cases, with several jurors noting publicly that they found Diana's motivation understandable, even while concluding that her actions constituted murder under territorial law. Judge Richard Caldwell sentenced Diana to death by hanging, scheduled for August 15, 1854. The sentence was mandatory under territorial statutes for murder convictions and allowed no judicial discretion regardless of circumstances. Caldwell delivered the sentence with visible reluctance, noting that the case presented moral complexities that the law was ill-equipped to address, but that his duty required him to apply legal standards as written. The hanging was scheduled for dawn on August 15, 1854, in the courtyard of the Santa Fe Territorial Prison. Authorities had chosen the early hour, hoping to minimize the crowds that had been gathering since Diana's trial concluded. But by 5 in the morning, over 2,000 people had assembled outside the prison walls. They came from across the territory and beyond, drawn by a case that had become a national sensation, representing different perspectives on justice, slavery, and the limits of human endurance under oppression. Diana spent her final night in a stone cell barely large enough to contain the wooden cot that served as her bed. She'd been permitted no visitors except Reverend Thomas Hayes, a Presbyterian minister who'd offered spiritual counsel she'd politely declined. She had no interest in reconciling herself to a God who'd allowed the system that destroyed her daughter to flourish. No desire for comfort from religious authorities who'd blessed the institution of slavery while preaching about divine mercy. Instead, she spent those final hours thinking about Rebecca, about the life her daughter might have lived in a world structured differently, about all the people still trapped in circumstances that gave them no options except endurance or resistance that would likely end in death. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent poisoning Thomas Holloway, about whether that campaign had accomplished anything beyond satisfying her need to strike back against someone who'd treated her as property. Marshal Crawford came for her at dawn, his expression grave as he escorted her from the cell to the courtyard where the scaffold waited. Diana walked without assistance, her head raised, her bearing dignified despite the chains that bound her wrists. She'd decided that if she was going to die for murdering her owner, she would die in a way that demonstrated she'd never truly been the subservient creature that slavery required her to pretend to be. The courtyard filled with official witnesses required by territorial law, including Judge Caldwell, who'd sentenced her, Marshal Crawford, who'd arrested her, and representatives from the governor's office who would certify that the execution had been carried out according to legal requirements. Dr. Nathan Porter attended as well, the physician who'd treated Thomas Holloway without ever suspecting that his patient's cook was systematically poisoning him over 7 years. Diana mounted the scaffold steps with steady stride, refusing the hood that was customarily placed over condemned prisoners' heads. She wanted to face death with open eyes, to see the faces of those who'd gathered to witness her execution, to look directly at the system that had brought her to this moment. The executioner positioned her on the trap door, adjusted the noose around her neck, and stepped back to await the signal. Judge Caldwell asked if Diana had any final words. She looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces, representing every perspective on her case, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent courtyard. "You're executing me for murder, but the real crime was slavery itself," she said. "Thomas Holloway bought and sold human beings like livestock. He separated families for profit. He sold my daughter to a brothel where she was killed. That was legal under your laws. I poisoned him slowly over 7 years until his body failed. That was illegal. I leave you to judge which action was truly criminal." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd before continuing. "You think you're ending something by hanging me, but you're wrong. Every enslaved person who prepares food for their owners now knows what I did and how I did it. Every cook in every kitchen throughout this territory has learned that patience and poison can accomplish what immediate rebellion cannot. You can execute me, but you cannot execute the knowledge I've shared or the example I've provided." The signal was given at 6:15 in the morning. The trapdoor opened and Diana dropped through empty space, the rope snapping taut with a sound that echoed off stone walls. But the execution did not proceed as planned. The rope, weakened by age or perhaps deliberately sabotaged, began to fray under Diana's weight. For nearly a minute she hung suspended, while the hemp fibers separated strand by strand, her body convulsing as she struggled against suffocation. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the rope finally broke completely, dropping Diana onto the ground beneath the scaffold. She landed hard, bones breaking from the impact, but remained conscious and alive. The executioner and his assistant scrambled to retrieve her, to complete the execution with a second rope. But the symbolic power of that broken rope had already transformed the moment from routine execution into something approaching martyrdom. The second rope held, and Diana died at 6:23 in the morning on August 15, 1854. But the story of her execution, particularly the detail about the rope breaking, spread rapidly through communities of enslaved people across the Southwest. Some interpreted it as divine intervention, proof that even God questioned the justice of executing someone for resisting their own enslavement. Others saw it as symbolic confirmation that some acts of resistance could not be easily contained or concluded, that Diana's defiance would outlive her physical death. Her body was buried in the prison cemetery without marker or ceremony, but within days flowers began appearing on the disturbed earth. Kitchen workers from Santa Fe brought herbs and cooking implements, creating a shrine that authorities repeatedly dismantled only to see it reappear. The grave became a pilgrimage site for enslaved people who traveled there when they could, paying respects to someone who demonstrated that the powerless were not necessarily helpless. The impact of Diana's case extended far beyond her individual story. In the months following her execution, reports of suspicious deaths among slave owners increased throughout the Southwest and into neighboring territories. Authorities could never definitively link these deaths to deliberate poisoning or establish that they represented coordinated resistance rather than coincidental natural deaths. But the pattern was clear enough to create widespread anxiety among those who'd profited from slavery. Kitchen staff became objects of suspicion in ways that fundamentally altered household dynamics. Wealthy families implemented elaborate precautions including food tasting, restricted access to kitchens, and constant supervision of meal preparation. These measures acknowledged that enslaved workers might possess both the knowledge and motivation to poison their owners, a recognition that undermined the comfortable fiction that slavery created contented servitude. The psychological impact proved as significant as any actual poisoning campaign. Slave owners throughout the region began experiencing symptoms that might indicate arsenic exposure, psychosomatic responses to fear that produced real physical distress. Doctors reported increased consultations from wealthy patients convinced they were being poisoned, though medical examinations typically found no evidence of toxic exposure. The paranoia itself became a form of resistance's legacy, making those who profited from slavery experience constant vulnerability. Diana's story entered the growing body of slave narratives that abolitionists circulated in northern states, though her methods proved controversial even among those opposed to slavery. Some abolitionists celebrated her as a freedom fighter, who'd struck back against oppression using the only means available to her. Others worried that emphasizing her use of poison might reinforce racist stereotypes about enslaved people being dangerous and untrustworthy, undermining arguments for emancipation. But within enslaved communities, Diana became a legendary figure whose story was told and retold with variations that emphasized different aspects of her resistance. Some versions focused on her patience, the 7 years she'd spent carefully poisoning Holloway while maintaining perfect cover. Others highlighted her intelligence, the sophisticated understanding of chemistry and human physiology she'd developed without formal education. All versions celebrated her refusal to accept powerlessness, her determination to achieve justice through whatever means circumstances permitted. The techniques Diana had used spread through informal networks that connected enslaved people across vast distances. Kitchen workers shared knowledge about plant toxicology, discussed dosing strategies, and learned from each other's experiences in ways that created distributed expertise no authority could fully suppress. This knowledge served multiple purposes beyond actual poisoning, functioning as psychological comfort that came from knowing resistance remained possible, even in situations that seemed completely controlled. When the Civil War finally came 7 years after Diana's execution, Union forces advancing through the Southwest discovered that plantation households throughout the region had been experiencing mysterious illnesses and deaths for years. Some military intelligence officers recognized patterns suggesting systematic resistance campaigns, though documentation remained sparse because enslaved people had learned to share knowledge without creating evidence that could be used against them. Modern historians studying this period have found limited direct evidence of coordinated poisoning campaigns, but the indirect evidence proves compelling. Medical records from the 1850s show unusual clusters of unexplained deaths among slave owners. Contemporary accounts describe widespread paranoia about food safety in wealthy households. And the oral histories, preserved in formerly enslaved communities, consistently reference this era as a time when kitchen workers discovered power that came from patience and knowledge rather than immediate violence. Diana's grave in the Santa Fe Prison Cemetery eventually received an official marker, placed in 1968 during a period when civil rights activists sought to honor historical figures who'd resisted oppression through any means necessary. The inscription reads simply Diana, died August 15, 1854, but visitors leave offerings that reflect the cooking skills she'd transformed into weapons, herbs, and spices arranged on the earth above her bones. What happens when one person's act of resistance becomes a legend that inspires generations of others to recognize their own capacity for defiance? Diana discovered that some victories are measured not in immediate outcomes but in the knowledge they create, the examples they provide, and the ways they transform how powerless people understand the possibilities available to them. She died on a scaffold in Santa Fe, but her story lived on in kitchens throughout the Southwest, a recipe for resistance that could never be fully suppressed because it existed in the memories and determination of people who'd learned that patience could be a weapon, and that those who controlled the food controlled more power than their oppressors ever suspected. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.